Hello and welcome to another Developer Essentials. So this time around, we're taking a look at particle systems. Now, with particle systems, I'm going to be taking a look at them in the built-in pipeline. If we were looking at them in the high-def pipeline or the universal pipeline, we would have also the option there of using the visual effects graph. Now, with built-in, we have using the classical particle system there, so we're going to be focusing on that. Now, particles are something that we will absolutely have seen games where there are particles in it. If we've seen things where we've got rain or snow falling, where we've got dust in the air, where we've got smoke or sparks or things like that, those are typically going to be done with particle systems. So let's take a look and see. So I've already got a particle system set up here. And at essence, what a particle system does is it's a very efficient way of being able to emit things, to spawn things, and they could be a billboarded sprite or they could be a mesh, but it's a very efficient way of spawning things and then having them undergo some movement typically. And this is something where if we were doing this by spawning game objects, things like that, the performance would be horrendous. But if we're working directly with a particle system, it's able to do that very efficiently. So let's take a look at what we've got here in terms of with this. So, and see the kinds of things we can be creating. So I'm over in the scene view here, and when I have a particle system selected, you'll see one of the things it's doing is it's going to be drawing boxes around the actual particles themselves. And we also have this extra set of controls here where we can see how many particles there are. We can stop it if we want. We can tell it to play. We can restart it. So we've got control over it. And we can see the number of active particles. That's the thing, this has already got 50 in it. And we can control how many there are. So let's take a look at a bunch of the settings here. So we've got a lot of different settings here for the particle system, and we want to take a bit of a look at what do these different ones do. And that's what I want to focus on, of working through these, looking at the kinds of things that they actually do. So duration, well, let's see what duration controls. If I change that to 1, I don't really see any difference. And that's because this is a looping one. If I turned off it being looping and did play, then duration is how long it emits particles for. So if I change that to 5 and restarted it, then it'll emit for 5 seconds. So duration comes into play when we have a particle system that isn't looping. So something if we are playing a shower of sparks or things like that. So that's what duration is controlling, that time period over which things are emitting. Delay is going to do a similar thing. Our lifetime, that controls, if we change it, how long they're alive for, which that then ties in with things like the speed, because the faster a particle is, the farther it can move in its lifetime. Well, the slower it is, the less of a distance it'll move. So if I reduce that speed, you can see the particles are really closely concentrated. They don't get particularly far. So we can get a lot of control just from working with those particular settings of adjusting the lifetime and everything. If I change the lifetime back to 1, a really slow speed, then again, we get, this would be more for sort of smoke coming from a fire. We can get that kind of slow sort of emission of stuff. So this is how I usually work with the particle systems. I go through and I get the movement, the motion of it, behaving the way that I want it to first, before I even start looking at things like how I want to color it, stuff like that. Now, emission is a particularly interesting area here in that we can control our rate over time. So I could make this that if that's at 10, if I went to 1, very small amount of particles. If I went to 100, got a huge cloud of the particles that are being emitted. So rate over time is for constant background emission of ones. We can also have bursts that will happen. So if I have a burst of potentially 100 particles, then that's something where this is going to fire at the beginning. So when I and it'll fire at a particular interval, so I can control that. So there we go, it fires, we get another interval. I can adjust when that is likely to be happening. We can have probabilities of ones here. So it lets us have, for showers of sparks in particular, the one particle system, you could have multiple bursts, because I could turn off it being a rate over time. And let's say I turn off looping, just as a way of easily testing. I can see, well, I get a cloud of ones emitting. I could then have another cloud, and that might emit at 0.5. So we can see that set up there. I can change that timing, so maybe it's after 1 second. It's still having everything fairly closely clustered together, and let's make it a larger chunk of ones. Restart. You can see the two distinct ones there. Increase the time that happens at. So this is handy if you're wanting to kick off sequences of particular things. So like a set of sparks, you could have two really rapid bursts, for example, and it's all then just in the one sort of particle system. So I'm going to have this be more as just a one shot like that. And we could have a very low rate of ones then over time in the background. So it's like a case there where we've got a few different sort of particles just sort of spitting out, but then we've got big bursts coming out. So this, we'd give it a duration of 5, seems pretty good for that. So this, I'm going to label this one burst. I'm going to move this one over here. And then I'm going to just have a continuous one, just so we can experiment with getting a couple of different styles of ones up and running. So the continuous one, I'm going to get rid of all of these so that we don't have any particular ones there, but we have just a continuous set of ones as it is looping. So this, we're getting a huge stream of ones. And turn back on the shape, because that's the other thing. We can control the shape that these are being emitted at. So in this case, there's a cone of ones. So the particles are actually streaming out in a particular angle. And we can control the shape and angle of that. That will allow us to make this be more directional, or just very scattered, depending upon what we're wanting to do with it. So shape, really handy. We've got a lot of different shapes. So huge range of different shapes that we can be using for the emission process. So it gives us a lot of excellent control over the behavior, the appearance that we get with it. Things like boxes, stuff like that are great for if you're wanting to have a whole bunch of rain pouring down. But we have lots of other ones where we can control the volume, the area that stuff's actually being emitted in. So shape, really handy. Lots of controls there in terms of adjusting things like where it's emitting from, if it's just from the base or if it's within the entire volume of it. So in that case, the particles are not all starting at the bottom, but we can actually switch that back if we want. So again, depends upon the setup. Volume would be great for things like if we want those little sort of bright dust particles in the air, that's where you could use something like volume, and you just get those little sort of bright particles moving through the air in places. So, okay, that's cool. What about the direction that things are moving? And in particular, well, if we go back to the burst one, well, sparks aren't just going to fly up like that. We want them to have gravity. So we can control. So it's got gravity. So for now, I'm just going to have this be looping just because that makes it easier to actually test. So you can see as soon as we put on gravity, it's really kind of not going anywhere. And that's because as soon as we've got gravity on, well, we need to start then adjusting the speed of things. And that is immediately starting to look kind of a lot cooler because things are falling down, which is great. And these bursts are just going flying all over the place. again, looking kind of cool. So that speed is really important there. It has to be adjusted and balanced with the gravity. It does default to 0, which is why we've got our smoke particles were always just going up, whereas these ones are now going down. And that's something where you can then do a lot of things where you vary velocity over the time. So again, these things, what you do is you turn on particular extra functionalities. So you can control what space the velocity stuff is calculated in, and we can adjust things. So, let's see if I applied 5 here, you can see, so its y-axis is going to be over that way. If I change its space to world, we can see that sends things up flying really, really high. I did a little bit, then it scatters them now a bit more. It's giving them more of an upwards velocity there. We can also, one of the things you'll notice is these arrows, we actually have a random option here. So we can configure curves. We can also say, I want it to be random. So I want to randomize the velocity there, potentially adding maybe 1, maybe up to 5. And that would let me change the start speed here back down a lot lower. So bring that down lower because I've now applied some randomness to the velocity. And that randomness on the velocity means, you can see it's immediately sort of everything is a little bit more spread out. Everything's a little bit messier and noisier, which is what we want. We want a bit of that variation there with it. So we get that burst of things pouring out, and then we get that variation, which is cool. And we could do a similar thing with our particles here, where, okay, we might want to have a little bit of randomness on the velocity, and not much though. So I think, again, we have it that we've got a little bit of, it can either increase or decrease, but it's not a huge amount. So some bits of the sort of smoke are going off, down, some bits are heading up, but we're not sort of going too overboard with it. And we can adjust that down a little bit so it's not too high. We're only getting small variations, and we do have a modifier that we can just apply generally on the speed. So that's another way that we could actually do this. If we change that back to constant and this to 0, then a speed modifier could be random between two constants. And maybe it can go to 0.5, so it can decrease it, or it can increase it by 50%. So again, another way where it's just applying, we're not applying it on individual components, we're applying it on particular elements. We can also mess with things like we can limit velocities, stuff like that. So we can have the speed affect lifetime, lots of cool options that we've got here with these. So really powerful for being able to control that. We can do more stuff with the movement. Because that was velocity, so that's a very direct speed. But we can also apply forces, which is handy. We can also, and this one is going to be best on the smoke here, we can apply noise. So noise can be really, really handy. So we'll turn on the noise and we see it starts to make it really chaotic. It's going all over the place. So we generally are going to need to adjust the settings here for this, because this is great for stuff like dirt, dust, things like that in the air. But we want to control the amount that it's actually changing the stuff, because this is really strong at the moment. So you can see if I drop that down to 0, makes no impact. If I change it to 0.1, not really visible. We can switch to 0.5. We're seeing it's quite visible at that point. We could go to something like 0.25. And we can see there's a little bit more there in terms of variation than if we didn't have noise. So if we don't have noise, it follows a fairly clean conical shape. As soon as we turn on noise, it's starting to spread out a bit more, especially as it's getting higher up, which is good. So again, noise is a good way to make stuff a bit sort of choppier and messier. If we went to our burst one, and then looked at putting noise on it. So by default, again, that noise is going to make it just go really way too chaotic. But we can lower the strength a bunch. And then that's sort of now behaving a lot better. It's still chaotic. We don't notice a huge difference with it. And with this, we might be able to get up to 0.5. And that seems okay. Might be something that we need to then come back and tweak a bit further later. We have stuff where we can be changing things like rotation and that. That's going to be more noticeable if we were working with meshes. We're not really going to notice with these particular particles. We can have collision. And this is really handy. So if we turn on collision, then we can set a particular plane in the world. So for example, ground. And then we can tell it what it want it to do. At the moment, what it's doing is it's bouncing off of that, because we can see bounce is 1. What we do is if we change that to 0, then it slides along it. So this would be, for things like sparks and that kind of is what you would expect of them skittering along the ground a little bit. You can make it that changes their lifetime. So for example, that is making the lifetime loss way too high. But we could make it 0.5. And again, still losing way too much. But for 0.1, it's a little bit better. We probably need to offset our particle system here a little bit from the ground. But it's losing a little bit too much in terms of the lifetime there. If we dropped it to 0.1, that's better. But so the lifetime loss is not ideal. We could dampen it, so slow down how far it actually moves. But these tend to slow it down quite a lot. So these have a fairly large impact. And so we need to be a little bit sort of cautious with the amount of impact that we're allowing it to have with this. Because it's then scattering all the way over it, so it very rapidly just moves along it. So collision is something we can have there. It is not the cheapest. So we do need to be cautious with that collision is more expensive. You can have collision messages, so you can get notifications that your code can react to when you have had collisions happen. But keep in mind the collisions are not cheap, so these are not something where you want to be doing them a lot or having them happen with really complex geometry. So, okay, that's cool. We also have options for having particles that animate by switching between textures along the way. We have controls in terms of lighting. So with lighting, we can control how that's impacting on the particular particles. We do need to give it a light. So for example, bring up our directional light. So it only supports 0.1s, as we can see. So if we added into the scene a point light, and let's move this up so it is at 0.5 and 2. So we'll move this light so it's here, and we will change the color of it so that it stands out a little bit more. So this is then something where with that first one and the lights, we can link up our point light, and then we can control what sort of the effects are that are going to happen there with it. So we have our settings here, like our ratio, so how many particles have that actual light source attached to them. So if we do 1, that actually makes it that these particles emit light. So you can see we're getting this bright sort of setup there. That's having those particles actually emit light. So really handy, but again, want to be mindful of the number of particles we have there, that can very, very rapidly get very expensive. And so that does need that point light attached to it, otherwise it's not going to be able to emit ones. We can have it where it's using the particle color. So now it's back to using that template lights color, or we can use the light, it'll override the color of the light. There, if we wanted, control the maximum number of lights, which we do want to be mindful of, because this is a lot of potential lights and can get very expensive very, very rapidly. So I'm going to turn that off and also turn off our point light for now. Because now another really cool thing, because these sparks, we're at the stage where we can start to sort of set up visuals and that. These sparks don't really look that much like sparks. So what we can do is this is where trails come in handy. Now, by default, we turn on the trails and that looks horrendous. And that's because these trails, typically their width is going to default to being super large. So first thing we often want to do is reduce the width of these, and especially for something like a spark, it's going to be pretty narrow sort of trail. So that looks sort of better in terms of with the sparks, but the stuff like the color and things like that, we're not seeing any changes to it. And that's because down in renderer, we need to actually give it a material for the trails. So I'm going to create a material here, matte spark trail. So when I set this over here, material spark trail, so okay, we've got some colors there coming through, it's kind of grayish. And then we want to see, okay, well, color over lifetime. So at the moment, this is just a fixed color, but we often would have a gradient. So we can set, okay, well, the start color, and we're getting some fun UI issues. I'll ignore those for now. We'll change the start color. So it might start as being a sort of reddish yellow that's near white. So it's really sort of a bright, intense one. And then by the end, we want it to be more sort of a dull, almost like a ember sort of that's going out sort of color. And we've done that, but we're not seeing color changes happen here with this. We've told it, okay, well, here's the color I want you to have over the lifetime. And color over trail, we could look at adjusting as well. We could turn off inheriting the particle color, but it's still not changing. And so our material, if we take a look at our material, we do generally need different shaders for this. So under particles, we do have different ones. So we have surface or unlit. In this case, a standard unlit one is going to work. So we can do particles and go back to our burst one. So we can kind of see those trails changing over lifetime, which is good. These trails are really long though, super, super long. We don't really want the trails to be that long. So we can adjust their lifetime. We can change it. So, okay, lifetime, not 1, let's go for 0.5. You can see this starting to disappear a little bit more, but still not great. So we drop it down even further. That's looking a little bit better. We notice really choppy, sharp, sort of angular aspect to the trails. And that's because that's the distance between the particular segments of it. So again, with the trail, we can adjust. So minimum vertex distance in this case is 0.2. I could change that to something like 0.1. That's going to make those a little bit smoother, and we can see those are tending to be a bit smoother. I could reduce that further so that now they're looking much, much, much smoother. So we're starting to get better appearance there for it. But we still want to change that actual particle that it's emitting, because I want it to have this same sort of color intensity. So I can copy my gradient. And what I can do is we have color over lifetime. So we can turn on color over lifetime. We can we can change this once we've turned it on. Can switch this over to, it's already on a gradient. And so we can paste in our gradient. So now that's following those, which is good. Size is still really large though. So we can again adjust the size. If we shrink it down to something like 0.5, that's a little bit better. Probably shrink it further again. So now we have a much sort of smaller setup ones. And so we can see that's looking pretty good. Now we could certainly adjust the particular object that's being emitted there. We also could actually turn off that particular one that it's showing. So in the one that it's sort of put in there, because render mode, if we switch that to none, we just get the trails, which just the trails looks pretty good in terms of being sort of sparks coming from something. Especially if I tweak the shape here a bit. So I can take the shape and I can adjust that. So at the moment the radius is currently really quite large. If I drop that, so it's a much smaller emission area, and we can see that a little bit clearer in the scene view. We can just shrink everything down, and you can, if it's getting a bit slow for during that emission, you can actually stop the particular one from running. So that'll shrink down the emission area there. We could also make it that it's emitting in a hemisphere instead. Might work a little bit nicer. And so we can play, that's looking pretty good. So give this a really simple sort of setup for being able to customize it. So that's our burst one. And let's get our continuous one going as well, because our continuous one, we want it to look more smoky. So again, going back to this whole thing of changing the color over the lifetime. So color over lifetime, we can make it a gradient or a random between two gradients. So if we're dealing with sort of smoke fire and that, it's not going to be super, super white, a lot of it. A bunch of it is going to be fairly gray and sort of sooty looking. And so now we've got a much sootier looking color there. We can chuck in a bit more gray. So we've got variation there, but it immediately is looking a lot better. Okay, we can, with the alpha, change it so that over time, it actually is fading out and getting less dense. Do the same with this one as well. Change the alpha here. So it starts, so we've got big, huge sort of billowing smoke coming out of this, but we're getting it nicely fading. You know, this one we can make it a little bit gray, heading towards the white. Immediately gives us a much, much better visual appearance for it. And we could change the particular sprite that's being emitted here. You know, in this case, this is something where we've got a really, really rapid emission happening with this. But we could slow that down. And if we go over to actually playing it, we can then see, you know, we've got the smoke billowing out, and we could have, you know, a big, huge initial burst of smoke if we wanted. You know, we've got our sparks. If we line these up so that they are actually in the same spot, then, you know, this could be a case of, well, something's catching on fire, and we've got these sparks flying out of it, and we've got big, huge billow of smoke. So you can set up lots of different bits and pieces like this with particle systems, and they can really enhance your projects. You know, very quickly, we can get stuff up and running with it. So the big things that I would recommend when you're working with particles is initially get Don't focus on what the particular color of it is. Don't focus necessarily on things like of trails, unless you know that it's absolutely something that has to have trails. Focus initially on getting the shape and the manner in which the particles are moving working the way that you want. Get it so that it's got that right tone, that feel, and then start customizing things like the color over time, its speed, and so forth, chucking in things like of noise and other changes there for it. And you can customize stuff like the trails. Remember, with the trails, in terms of materials, you have to use one of the particle shaders on it. But other than that, you can easily have all of these up and running. We can attach lights to these, but we have to keep in mind that does come with a cost. Same as we can have these interact with collision, but again, does come with an increased cost. But there's a lot of cool things that we can be doing there with the particle systems. So as always with the code for these and the project, it's fully available up on GitHub, and you're able to use that for any of your own projects, whether they're commercial or non-commercial projects. So dive in and experiment with it. If you found the video helpful, please do chuck in a like and subscribe. And if you're looking for other ways to support the channel, then I do have a Patreon set up, and I've put the link to that in the description below. But otherwise, dive in and experiment and see the kinds of cool things you can create.